Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from forgetting what it means to show kindness to another living soul. In the bitter cold of a Wyoming winter, where survival often meant choosing between your own life and someone else's, Ezra McCready made a choice that would change everything. This giant of a cowboy, standing 7 feet tall and weathered by 53 hard years on the frontier, stumbled upon a starving wolf in the darkness. Most men would have reached for their gun. Ezra reached for his last piece of jerked beef. Instead, "I need a friend, and you need food," he whispered to the trembling creature. What started as a simple act of mercy became something much more powerful. In a land that showed no forgiveness, an unlikely friendship formed between a lonesome man and a desperate wolf. Together, they would face the brutal winter that seemed determined to claim them both. But could this bond between man and beast truly be strong enough to survive the harsh realities of frontier life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass compass had been his father's, passed down from a man who'd never seen country quite this wild or winters quite this merciless. Ezra McCready turned the tarnished instrument over in his massive hands as he sat by the crackling fire in his one-room cabin, watching the snow pile against the single window like nature's own prison bars. January 1883 had brought the kind of cold that made your bones ache just thinking about stepping outside. But Ezra had learned long ago that comfort was a luxury the Wyoming Territory didn't offer freely. At 53, he built this life with his own 2 hands after everything else had been stripped away. The cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by towering pines and jagged peaks, isolated enough that he could go weeks without seeing another human soul. That was how he preferred it now, though it hadn't always been that way. Once, he'd been a cavalry scout with a wife who laughed like wind chimes and 2 children who called him Papa with voices sweet as spring water. Once, he believed in community, in the promise of building something lasting together with other folks who shared the same dreams. The influenza had taken Mary and the children during the winter of '78, sweeping through the settlement like wildfire through dry grass. After he'd buried them in the frozen ground with his own hands, Ezra had packed what little remained of his former life into a wagon and headed deeper into the wilderness, searching for a place where memory couldn't follow so easily. His father's compass had guided him here, to this valley where the wind spoke in languages older than civilization, and the only neighbors were the deer that came to drink from the stream in summer and the hawks that circled overhead like patient sentinels. The compass had belonged to his father, a man who'd fought in the Mexican War and lived to tell stories that made young Ezra's eyes grow wide with wonder. Before consumption claimed him, the old man had pressed the instrument into his son's palm and said, "This'll always point you toward home, boy. But you got to remember that home ain't always a place on a map." Now, as Ezra studied the compass, needle trembling toward magnetic north, he wondered if his father had been right. Home had once been Mary's smile and his children's laughter. These days, it felt more like absence than presence, more like the echo of voices than the voices themselves. The compass couldn't point him toward what he'd lost, but it had led him to this valley where he could live with his ghosts in something resembling peace. The cabin was solid work. Built from lodgepole pines, he'd felled himself and chinked with mud and moss to keep out the worst of the wind. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, crafted from river rocks he'd hauled up from the creek bottom during the brief summer months. His bed was a simple frame with a straw mattress, covered by quilts Mary had sewn during their early years together. He'd kept those quilts even though looking at them sometimes felt like pressing on a bruise that would never quite heal. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the thick glass window he'd hauled in from Cheyenne at considerable expense. The storm had been building for 2 days, and by Ezra's estimation, They were in for at least another day of heavy snow before it passed. He'd prepared well, as he always did. The root cellar held enough potatoes, turnips, and preserved meat to last until spring, if necessary. Firewood was stacked 8 feet high along the north wall of the cabin, split in season during the warmer months when such work didn't require a man to fight for every breath. This was his routine now. Prepare, endure, survive. Rise before dawn to tend the fire and check his simple snares. Spend the daylight hours maintaining his equipment, mending what needed mending, improving what could be improved. In the evenings, he'd sit by the fire with his father's compass, sometimes reading from one of the 3 books he owned, the Bible, a collection of Shakespeare's plays, and a volume of Walt Whitman's poetry that Mary had given him for their 5th wedding anniversary. The loneliness was a living thing most days, settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat that he could never quite shrug off. He talked to himself sometimes, carrying on conversations with memory that felt both necessary and foolish. He talked to Mary, telling her about the weather, about the deer he'd seen, about small repairs he'd made to the cabin. He talked to his children, sharing observations about the changing seasons and the way the light fell across the valley at different times of year. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the loneliness had teeth. Maybe it was the storm, the way it seemed to press against the cabin walls like something alive and hungry. Maybe it was the date January 15th would have been his daughter's birthday, had she lived to see 21. Or maybe it was simply the accumulated weight of too many solitary evenings, too many conversations with ghosts who never answered back. Ezra set the compass aside and moved to the window, peering out into the swirling darkness. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that caught what little light escaped from his cabin and turned it into something almost magical, beautiful and deadly, like so much of this country. A man could die within 100 yards of shelter if he lost his way in weather like this. Could freeze to death so close to warmth that rescue might have been possible if only someone had known to look. That's when he saw them, yellow eyes reflecting the cabin's glow, watching him from the edge of the clearing. Wolf eyes, unmistakable in their intensity and intelligence. Most men would have reached for a rifle, would have assumed the worst about any predator bold enough to approach human habitation. But something in those eyes gave Ezra pause, some quality of desperation that he recognized from his own mirror. The creature was thin, too thin, for a healthy wolf in winter. Even through the snow and darkness, Ezra could see the way its ribs showed beneath its coat, could read the story of hunger and hardship written in the careful way it held itself. This wasn't a predator looking for easy prey. This was a survivor, like himself, doing whatever it took to make it through another brutal night. Ezra's hand moved not to his rifle, but to the small pouch where he kept his emergency rations. Jerked. Beef, hardtack, a few pieces of dried fruit that Mary had taught him to preserve. His supplies were carefully calculated, enough to see him through the worst of winter with a small margin for emergencies. Sharing with a wild animal wasn't practical or wise, but wisdom felt less important than the recognition he saw in those amber eyes. He opened the door slowly, letting the bitter wind rush into the cabin and send the fire dancing in the hearth. Behind him, the wolf tensed but didn't flee, watching as Ezra stepped onto his small covered porch with hands visible and movements deliberately calm. "Easy now," Ezra said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd once used to gentle spooked horses. "I know that look. I know that hunger." He reached into the pouch and withdrew a piece of jerked beef, holding it out toward the wolf while maintaining careful distance. The animal's nostrils flared as it caught the scent of food, but it remained frozen in place, caught between desperate need and hard-learned caution. "I need a friend," Ezra said quietly, surprising himself with the admission. "And you need food. Seems like we might be able to help each other." The wolf took one tentative step forward, then another. Its eyes never left Ezra's face, reading him the way wild things learn to read the world, looking for threat, for deception, for the subtle signs that might mean the difference between life and death. Ezra set the jerked beef on the porch and stepped back, giving the creature space to make its choice. The compass sat forgotten on the table inside, its needle still pointing toward magnetic north. But out here in the snow with a starving wolf, Ezra felt like he might finally be pointed towards something that mattered more than mere direction. The wolf crept forward and took the offered food, retreating quickly to the edge of the clearing to consume it. When it finished, it looked back toward Ezra with what might have been gratitude, though he knew better than to assign too much human emotion to a wild creature's behavior. Still, as he watched the wolf disappear into the storm, Ezra felt something shift inside his chest, the first stirring of hope he'd experienced in longer than he cared to remember. The loneliness was still there, as heavy as ever, but now it had company. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd set aside a little more jerked beef. Not enough to endanger his own survival, but enough to see if those yellow eyes might return. In a world that seemed determined to strip away everything a man held dear, maybe the simple act of feeding a hungry creature could be the beginning of something worth holding on to. The storm raged on, but inside his cabin, Ezra McCready felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in his stone hearth. The wolf returned the next evening, appearing at the edge of the clearing just as the last light was fading from the winter sky. This time, it came closer, emboldened by memory of food and the absence of violence, though it still maintained the careful distance of a creature that had learned not to trust too readily. Ezra had been waiting, watching from his window with a perspective, with a piece of jerked beef ready in his hand. The sight of those amber eyes reflecting his lamplight sent an unexpected surge of warmth through his chest, the feeling of being expected, of mattering to another living being, even if that being happened to be a wild predator that could tear his throat out if it chose. "Back again, are you?" Ezra murmured as he stepped onto the porch. The cold bit at his face immediately, but he barely noticed. The wolf's ears swiveled forward at the sound of his voice, alert but not alarmed. "Can't say I blame you. Food's hard to come by in weather like this." He set the jerked beef on the porch rail this time, closer to the cabin than the night before. The wolf approached more confidently, though it still watched Ezra with the hypervigilant attention of prey that had learned predators could wear friendly faces. As the wolf ate, Ezra studied it more carefully. Definitely a male, probably 4 or 5 years old based on his size and the graying around his muzzle. His coat was primarily gray and black, with patches of white at his chest and paws that caught the lamplight like fresh snow. He was large for a wolf, though still lean from hunger, his ribs visible beneath the thick winter fur. "You got a name?" Ezra asked quietly. The wolf's ears flicked toward him at the sound, though his attention remained focused on the food. "Course you don't. Names are human foolishness, aren't they? But a man's got to call you something if you're going to keep showing up at my door." The wolf finished eating and lifted his head, studying Ezra with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold depths beyond mere animal instinct. In the lamplight, his coat appeared to shift and flow like liquid shadow, dark patches blending seamlessly with lighter ones until it was hard to tell where one color ended and another began. "Shadow," Ezra said suddenly. "That's what I'll call you if you don't object. Shadow, because you move like one, and because shadows got a way of appearing when a man most needs company." The wolf shadow tilted his head slightly, as if considering the name. Then, in a gesture that sent Ezra's heart racing with surprise, he took 2 steps closer to the porch. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that Ezra could see the individual snowflakes melting on his fur, could hear the soft sound of his breathing in the still air. They regarded each other in silence, Man and wolf, two solitary creatures finding something like kinship in the winter darkness. Ezra felt tears prick at his eyes, the first real tears he'd shed since burying his family. Not tears of grief, but of gratitude, of connection, of the simple miracle of being seen and remembered by another living soul. "I'll see you tomorrow night," Ezra said, as Shadow began to retreat toward the trees. "Same time, if you're willing." Over the following week, their evening encounters became routine. Shadow would appear at dusk, approaching closer each night as trust slowly replaced caution. Ezra found himself looking forward to these meetings with an anticipation that surprised him. The way Shadow's ears would perk up at the sound of his voice. The careful way the wolf would accept his offerings. The growing sense that this was becoming something more than mere charity dot on the seventh night. As Shadow finished his portion of jerked beef, Ezra made a decision that he knew crossed a line, from which there might be no return. He went inside and retrieved his old cavalry belt, warm leather that had seen him through the war and the early years of his marriage. Using his skinning knife, he carefully cut a length of the belt and worked it into a simple collar, punching holes with an awl and fashioning a crude buckle from a piece of bent metal dot. When he stepped back onto the porch, Shadow was waiting, head cocked with curiosity at this departure from their established routine. "Now, don't take this wrong," Ezra said, holding up the improvised collar. "I'm not trying to make a dog out of you. But if you're going to keep coming around, folks are going to notice eventually, and a wolf with a collar might be seen different than a wolf without one. Might be the difference between tolerance and a bullet, if you take my meaning." Shadow's eyes fixed on the leather collar, his nostrils flaring as he caught the familiar scent of the man who had been feeding him. When Ezra approached slowly, the wolf tensed but held his ground, a gesture of trust that felt more precious than gold. "Easy, boy," Ezra murmured, moving with the deliberate calm he'd learned handling wild horses during his cavalry days. "Just making things a little safer for both of us." To his amazement, Shadow lowered his head slightly, allowing Ezra to slip the collar around his neck. The wolf's fur was thick and soft beneath the leather, warmer than Ezra had expected, and he could feel the strong pulse of Shadow's heartbeat against his fingers as he worked the crude buckle closed. When it was done, Shadow stepped back and shook himself, testing the weight and feel of this new addition to his existence. The collar fit well snug enough to stay put, but loose enough not to restrict his movement. Against his dark fur, the weathered brown leather looked almost natural, like it belonged there. "There," Ezra said with satisfaction. "Now you're not just any wolf. You're my wolf, if anyone asks. Shadow McCready, I reckon, if we're being formal about it." The sound of his own surname attached to the wolf's name sent an unexpected jolt through Ezra's chest. He hadn't spoken that name aloud in conjunction with another living being since Mary's death. Hadn't imagined he'd ever have reason to share it again. But here in the snow with this wild creature who had chosen to trust him, it felt right in. A way that surprised him with its intensity, Shadow seemed to sense the significance of the moment. Instead of retreating to the tree line, as he usually did, he settled onto his haunches just at the edge of the porch, amber eyes reflecting the lamplight as he regarded his human benefactor with something that looked remarkably like contentment. They sat together in comfortable silence, man and newly collared wolf, while the snow fell around them like a blessing. Ezra felt a peace he hadn't known in years settling over him, the bone-deep satisfaction of connection, of mattering to another living being in a way that went beyond mere survival. When Shadow finally rose to leave, disappearing into the forest, with the ghost-quiet movement that had earned him his name, Ezra remained on the porch long after the wolf had vanished. The collar had changed everything, he realized. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the snow that marked this creature as under his protection. More than that, it was a promise to Shadow, to himself, to the memory of the man he used to be before grief had carved him hollow. Tomorrow night, Shadow would return wearing the collar made from Ezra's old belt, and the sight of it would remind them both that some bonds transcend the boundaries between species, that friendship can grow in the most unlikely soil if it's tended with patience and hope. Inside the cabin, his father's compass continued to point toward magnetic north, but Ezra no longer needed its guidance. He had found his direction in the amber eyes of a starving wolf, in the simple act of offering food to a creature that had no reason to trust him beyond the evidence of kindness itself. The transformation had begun, not just of Shadow from wild animal to something approaching companion, but of Ezra from isolated hermit to a man who had remembered what it meant to care for someone beyond himself. The collar was just leather and metal, but it carried the weight of that transformation, a visible symbol of the choice they had both made to reach across the vast divide between their separate worlds and touch something real. By the third week of their evening meetings, Shadow had begun lingering after his meals, settling near the porch steps in a way that suggested comfort rather than mere caution. The crude leather collar had become as much a part of him as his own fur, and Ezra found himself talking to the wolf during these extended visits, sharing thoughts and observations that had been bottled up inside him for far too long. "You know what I miss most?" Ezra said one particularly clear night, his breath-forming clouds in the frigid air as he sat on his porch step. Shadow lay curled about 10 feet away, close enough that Ezra could see the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, the sound of someone else moving around the house. Mary, she had this way of humming while she did her mending, nothing fancy. Just little tunes she'd make up as she went along. Made the whole place feel alive, you know? Shadow's ears swiveled toward Ezra at the sound of his voice, though the wolf's eyes remained closed in apparent contentment. There was something deeply satisfying about having a listener, even one who couldn't respond with words. Sometimes the best conversations were the ones where you didn't have to worry about saying the right thing or being understood in ways that required explanation. As the days passed, Ezra began to notice that Shadow was displaying behaviors that went beyond simple hunger-driven visits. The wolf would arrive early sometimes, before the usual feeding time, and would patrol the perimeter of Ezra's property with the alertness of a sentry. Twice, Shadow had alerted him to the presence of other animals, a black bear investigating his root cellar, and a cougar that had been stalking the deer that sometimes grazed in his meadow. It was during one of these early arrivals that Ezra decided to try something that felt both natural and revolutionary. He had been working on a piece of white pine, carving it into a simple whistle while sitting on his porch in the afternoon sun. The wood was soft and easy to work, and he found the repetitive motion of the knife soothing in a way that reminded him of his father's hands shaping similar projects during his boyhood. When Shadow appeared at the edge of the clearing, earlier than usual and moving with more energy than Ezra had seen since their first meeting, he looked up from his carving, with a smile that felt foreign on his wind-weathered face. "You're early today," Ezra observed. "Something got you stirred up, or are you just eager for supper?" Shadow approached closer than he ever had before, stopping just outside arm's reach and sitting with the patient attention of a student waiting for instruction. There was an intelligence in his amber eyes that went beyond animal cunning, a quality of engagement that made Ezra feel like he was being evaluated as much as he was evaluating. On impulse, Ezra lifted the half-finished whistle to his lips and blew a soft, low note. Shadow's head tilted immediately, ears pricked forward with keen interest. Ezra tried a different pitch, higher and clearer, and was rewarded by a subtle shift in Shadow's posture, not alarm, but recognition, as if the wolf understood that this sound was meant for him. "You like that, do you?" Ezra murmured, working the knife carefully to adjust the whistle's tone. "Let's see if we can make something you'll remember." He spent the next hour fine-tuning the instrument, testing different notes and watching Shadow's reactions. The wolf seemed particularly responsive to lower tones, his ears moving and his head tilting as if he were trying to decode some new language. When Ezra finally achieved a clear, resonant note that seemed to capture Shadow's full attention, he set the knife aside with satisfaction. "There," he said, offering the whistle for Shadow's inspection. The wolf leaned forward cautiously, sniffing at the carved wood before settling back on his haunches with what looked remarkably like approval. Now we got ourselves a way to talk. Proper-like. Over the following days, Ezra began incorporating the whistle into their routine. Different patterns of notes seemed to convey different meanings. A long, low call brought Shadow running from wherever he might be wandering, while shorter, sharper blasts served as warnings or requests for attention. To Ezra's amazement, Shadow began responding to these signals with increasing sophistication, approaching when called, stopping when signaled, even retreating to a safe distance when Ezra played a particular sequence that they had established meant danger. The breakthrough came when Shadow began initiating communication himself. One evening, as Ezra sat whittling by lamplight, he heard a soft whine from outside, not the desperate sound of hunger or distress, but something more conversational. When he looked up, Shadow was sitting by the porch steps, regarding him with expectant eyes. "You want to talk, is that it?" Ezra asked, setting down his carving. He picked up the whistle and played a gentle, questioning note. Shadow's ears perked up, and he made a soft huffing sound that Ezra had learned to interpret as contentment or agreement. They spent the next hour in what could only be described as conversation. Ezra playing simple melodies on the whistle, Shadow responding with various vocalizations, both of them clearly engaged in an exchange that had meaning even if its exact content remained mysterious. There was joy in it, Ezra realized, the simple pleasure of communication with another intelligent being, regardless of species. But it was more than entertainment or companionship that was developing between them. Shadow had begun exhibiting protective behaviors that went beyond mere gratitude for regular meals. He would position himself between Ezra and any perceived threats, would investigate unusual sounds or scents around the property, and had even started following Ezra on his short trips to check snares or gather firewood, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly serving as a guardian. The morning Ezra woke to find wolf tracks circling his cabin in a perfect perimeter, he understood that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. This wasn't just a wild animal accepting charity from a human. This was a partnership, a mutual agreement of protection and care that honored both their natures while creating something entirely new. That evening, as Shadow settled into his usual spot near the porch, Ezra found himself sharing something he hadn't spoken aloud since Mary's death. "I had a son once," he said quietly, his hands working automatically to clean the whistle he'd carved for their communication. Thomas. He would have been about 25 now if the sickness hadn't taken him. Had his mother's eyes and her way of making everything seem possible. Used to follow me around when I was working, asking questions about everything under the sun. Shadow's ears flicked forward at the change in Ezra's tone, and the wolf lifted his head with the kind of attention that suggested he understood this was important, even if the words themselves held no meaning for him. "I never thought I'd have that again," Ezra continued, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Someone who chose to spend time with me, who trusted me enough to stay close. I know you're not him, and I'm not trying to make you into something. You're not. But having you here, knowing you'll come when I call and that you're watching out for me the way I'm watching out for you, well, it fills up a space that's been empty for a long time." Shadow rose from his resting place and moved closer, settling down just at the edge of the porch with his head resting on his paws. In the lamplight, his amber eyes held a warmth that seemed almost human in its understanding, and Ezra felt a connection that transcended the boundaries between species. The whistle in his hands had become more than a tool for communication. It was a bridge between two different worlds, a way for a lonely man and a solitary wolf to find common ground in the vast wilderness that surrounded them. When Ezra played it now, he wasn't just making noise or giving commands. He was speaking in a language they had created together, a vocabulary of trust and companionship that belonged to them alone as winter deepened around his small valley. Ezra McCready discovered that isolation didn't have to mean loneliness, and that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The whistle he'd carved from white pine had become the instrument of his salvation, and every note he played was a reminder that some bonds are strong enough to bridge any divide, even the one between man and wolf, the blizzard that struck in. Early February was the kind that old-timers spoke of in hushed tones, the sort of storm that could bury a man's cabin so deep he wouldn't find his way out until spring. Ezra had weathered plenty of Wyoming winters, but this one tested even his considerable experience as the wind howled like a living thing and snow piled against his walls in drifts taller than a man. He'd lost sight of his property boundaries by the second day, and by the third, he couldn't see his own woodpile from the cabin window. The world had been reduced to the small circle of warmth around his fireplace, and even with his careful preparations, he was beginning to worry about his fuel supply, lasting until the storm passed. It was on the fourth day, when the wind was at its most vicious and the cold had seeped through every crack in his chinked walls, that Ezra made the mistake that nearly cost him his life. The fire had burned low during the night, and in his drowsy state, he'd forgotten to banking it properly. When he woke to a cabin filled with smoke and the acrid smell of wet wood, he realized that his chimney had become blocked by ice and snow. Without thinking, he bundled into his heaviest coat and stepped outside to clear the obstruction, confident in his ability to navigate the short distance from his door to the side of the cabin where the chimney stood. But the storm had transformed his familiar surroundings into an alien landscape of shifting white, and within minutes of leaving his porch, Ezra found himself completely disoriented. The wind drove snow into his eyes with stinging force, and every direction looked the same, a wall of white that seemed to swallow his own footprints almost as soon as he made them. He called out, hoping his voice might echo off the cabin walls and give him direction. But the storm consumed the sound before it could travel more than a few feet. Panic began to rise in his chest as he realized the magnitude of his error. Men died this way, frozen to death within yards of safety because they couldn't find their way back to shelter. He'd seen the evidence himself during his cavalry days, bodies discovered after spring thaw, close enough to help that their deaths seemed especially cruel. That's when he heard it. A long, mournful howl cutting through the wind like a blade. Shadow's voice, unmistakable even through the chaos of the storm. Ezra turned toward the sound and saw a dark shape moving through the white, approaching with the purposeful gait of a creature that knew exactly where it was going. "Shadow," Ezra called, his voice cracking with relief and gratitude. The wolf appeared out of the storm like a miracle, his dark coat dusted with snow, but his amber eyes clear and focused. Without hesitation, Shadow moved to Ezra's side and began nudging him firmly in a specific direction, using his body to guide the disoriented man through the blinding snow dots step by step, with Shadow pressing against his legs to keep him on course. Ezra followed the wolf's guidance until the familiar outline of his cabin emerged from the white chaos. Never had his rough-hewn walls looked more beautiful, more like salvation itself made manifest in logs and chinking. Once they reached the porch, Shadow didn't retreat to his usual position at the edge of the clearing. Instead, he followed Ezra to the door, his meaning clear even without words. The storm was too fierce for any creature to survive outside, and the wolf's protective instincts had been triggered by his human friend's brush with disaster. Ezra didn't hesitate. He opened the door wide and gestured for Shadow to enter, crossing another threshold in their relationship that felt as significant as the caller had weeks before. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice still shaky from the close call. No sense in either of us freezing to death when we got a good fire and warm walls to share. Shadow stepped across the threshold with the careful dignity of a welcomed guest, his amber eyes taking in the unfamiliar interior of Ezra's home. The wolf moved cautiously, but without fear, investigating the scents and textures of human habitation while maintaining the respectful distance of a creature that understood boundaries. Ezra quickly set about clearing his chimney from the inside, using a long poker to break up the ice that had formed in the flue. Soon, the fire was drawing properly again, filling the cabin with blessed warmth and the comforting crackle of burning wood. When he turned back to check on his guest, he found Shadow investigating a trunk in the corner with gentle curiosity. "That's Mary's trunk," Ezra said softly, moving to the wooden chest that held the last physical remnants of his former life. "Haven't opened it in years, to tell the truth. Some things are easier to leave buried." But with Shadow's presence filling the cabin with life and companionship, the trunk no longer seemed like a monument to loss. Instead, it felt like a connection to something precious that deserved to be remembered rather than hidden away. Ezra knelt beside the trunk and lifted its heavy lid, revealing the carefully folded contents within. On top lay Mary's favorite shawl, knitted from soft wool in shades of blue and gray that reminded him of twilight over the mountains. Beneath it were the children's clothes, outgrown and precious, and a few small toys that had once filled the house with laughter. Shadow approached the open trunk with gentle curiosity, his nose twitching as he investigated these new scents that carried so much emotional weight for his human companion. When Ezra lifted Mary's shawl from the trunk, holding the soft wool against his cheek for a moment before spreading it on the floor near the fire, Shadow seemed to understand the significance of the gesture. The wolf settled onto the makeshift bed with a soft sigh, his large body fitting perfectly on the wool that had once wrapped around Ezra's beloved wife. The sight should have been painful, Ezra thought, but instead it filled him with a strange sense of peace. Mary's shawl was being used again, providing comfort and warmth to a creature that had shown him kindness when he needed it most. "She would have liked you," Ezra said, settling into his chair near the fire while Shadow arranged himself comfortably on the shawl. "Mary had a way with animals, could gentle the meanest horse or coax a frightened cat out of hiding. She used to say that creatures knew good hearts from bad ones, that they could see things in people that other people missed." As if responding to his name, Shadow lifted his head and regarded Ezra with those intelligent amber eyes. In the firelight, his expression seemed almost human in its depth of understanding, as if he recognized the importance of this moment, this sharing of sacred space and cherished memory. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, man and wolf shared a warmth that went beyond the physical heat of the fire. Ezra found himself talking about Mary and the children in ways he hadn't been able to since their deaths, describing their personalities and quirks to Shadow, as if the wolf were an old friend who had somehow missed meeting them during their lives. "Thomas, my boy, he had this way of collecting things," Ezra said, his voice soft with memory as he watched Shadow's ears twitch with attention. "Rocks, mostly, but also feathers and bits of interesting wood. Mary used to complain about finding his treasures in her bread bowl or tucked behind the stove, but she never threw them away. Said a person's collections told you something important about their soul." Shadow shifted slightly on the shawl, settling his head on his paws while maintaining eye contact with Ezra. There was something deeply comforting about having a listener, even one who communicated primarily through presence rather than words. "And little Sarah," Ezra continued, his throat tightening slightly around his daughter's name. "She would have been fascinated by you. Always trying to make friends with every creature that crossed our path, rabbits, squirrels, even the barn cats that wanted nothing to do with human affection. She had this laugh that could make you forget whatever troubles were weighing on you, just pure joy bubbling up like a spring." The wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside, The atmosphere had taken on a quality that reminded Ezra of the evenings when his family had been whole, when the simple act of being together had been enough to make any hardship bearable. Shadow's presence had somehow unlocked memories that had been too painful to revisit, transforming them from sources of grief into treasures worth sharing. As the night deepened and the fire settled into glowing coals, Ezra realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of loss and healing. For years, he had protected his memories of Mary and the children like wounds that might reopen if touched. But sharing them with Shadow, speaking their names aloud in the warm circle of firelight, had reminded him that love didn't die with the beloved. It lived on in the stories, the moments of joy that could still bring warmth to a winter night. "You know what the strangest part is?" Ezra said as he prepared to bank the fire for the night. "I feel closer to them now than I have in years. Not because the pain is gone, it's still there, probably always will be. But having you here, having someone to share their memory with, it makes them feel real again, instead of just ghosts that haunt me." Shadow lifted his head as Ezra moved around the cabin, performing his nightly routine of checking the fire and securing the door. When the man finally settled into his bed, the wolf remained on Mary's shawl, a living presence that filled the space with comfort rather than the echoing emptiness that had defined Ezra's nights for so long. The storm continued through the night, but neither man nor wolf stirred with anxiety. They had found something in each other that transcended the boundaries between species, between past and present, between memory and hope. In the morning, when the wind finally died and the snow stopped falling, they would face whatever challenges the aftermath brought together, bound by trust and mutual care that had grown stronger through shared shelter and shared stories. As Ezra drifted towards sleep, listening to Shadow's steady breathing and the settling of logs in the fireplace, he understood that healing didn't always come in the ways you expected. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a starving wolf, wearing a collar made from your old belt and sleeping on your dead wife's shawl, reminding you that love could be found again if you were brave enough to open your heart to unlikely possibilities. The shawl that had once wrapped Mary's shoulders now provided comfort to a creature that had saved Ezra's life. And in that circular exchange of care and protection, he found a peace that had eluded him through years of solitary grief. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time since his family's death, Ezra McCready was not alone with his memories. He was sharing them with a friend who understood the value of loyalty and the healing power of presence. Outside, the Wyoming winter continued its relentless assault on anything foolish enough to challenge its dominion. But inside the small cabin in the hidden valley, warmth and companionship had created a sanctuary that even the harshest weather could not breach. Spring came early that year, arriving in March with a warmth that coaxed snowmelt from the peaks and sent streams rushing through the valley with voices like excited children. Ezra had always loved this season of renewal, but this year it held special significance as he watched Shadow adapt to the changing world around them with the curiosity of a creature experiencing something entirely new. The wolf had taken to spending more time around the cabin during daylight hours, no longer restricting his visits to the safety of darkness. His presence had become as natural as the sunrise, and Ezra found himself planning his daily activities around their shared routines. Shadow would appear each morning as Ezra stepped outside to check his snares, following at a respectful distance. As the man went about his work, it was during one of these morning walks that Ezra discovered Shadow's remarkable intelligence in action. They had been walking the perimeter of Ezra's property when Shadow suddenly froze, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alertness. Before Ezra could ask what had caught the wolf's attention, Shadow was moving with purposeful urgency toward a section of fence that protected Ezra's small vegetable garden. There, caught in the wire mesh, was a young deer, a yearling that had tried to leap the barrier and become entangled instead. The animal was struggling frantically, its movements only serving to tighten the wire around its legs and causing wounds that would attract predators if not treated soon. "Easy there," Ezra murmured, approaching the trapped deer slowly while Shadow hung back, instinctively understanding that his predator presence would only increase the young animal's panic. "Let's see what we can do about this mess you've gotten yourself into." Working carefully with wire cutters from his toolkit, Ezra freed the deer's legs one at a time, speaking in the same calm tone he used with Shadow. The yearling remained still during the process, as if it understood that the human was trying to help rather than harm. When the last wire was cut and the deer was free, it bounded away into the forest with a grace that made both man and wolf pause in appreciation. "That's the third time this month you've alerted me to something that needed tending," Ezra observed as he and Shadow continued their walk. "Starting to think you've appointed yourself guardian of this whole valley, not just my cabin." Shadow's ears swiveled toward Ezra at the sound of his voice, and the wolf made a soft chuffing sound that had become part of their developing vocabulary. Over the months, they had established a complex system of communication that went far beyond the whistle Ezra had carved. Different sounds meant different things, and Shadow had proven remarkably adept at interpreting human emotions and intentions. Was that evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, that Ezra decided to introduce another element to their friendship. From inside the cabin, he retrieved the silver harmonica that had belonged to his father, an instrument that had provided comfort during his darkest days, but which he hadn't played since Mary's death. "This belonged to my pa," Ezra explained as he polished the tarnished silver with his shirt sleeve. "He used to play it in the evenings after supper, nothing fancy. Just simple tunes that helped settle the mind after a hard day's work. Mary always said it was the sound of contentment made into music." Shadow watched with interest as Ezra raised the harmonica to his lips and played a slow, gentle melody, something his father had called evening peace, though Ezra doubted it had a real name. The notes drifted across the clearing like a blessing, soft and contemplative, perfectly suited to the twilight hour when day surrendered to night. To Ezra's amazement, Shadow began to vocalize along with the music, not howling but producing low, melodious sounds that harmonized with the harmonica in ways that seemed impossible for a wild animal. The wolf's voice was hauntingly beautiful, adding depth and richness to the simple melody that transformed it into something transcendent. They played together for nearly an hour, Ezra on his father's harmonica and Shadow providing vocal accompaniment that seemed to come from some deep well of musical understanding. When they finally stopped, the silence that followed felt different from ordinary quiet. It was the satisfied silence that comes after meaningful communication, after souls have touched across the barriers of language and species. "Mary was right," Ezra said softly, lowering the harmonica and looking at Shadow with wonder. "Music is contentment made audible. And you, my friend, have a gift for it that would put most church choirs to shame." From that evening forward, their musical sessions became a regular part of their routine. As spring progressed and the days grew longer, Ezra would bring out his harmonica and Shadow would add his voice, creating concerts that seemed to draw the very forest closer to listen. Birds would gather in the nearby trees, deer would venture to the edge of the clearing, and even the usually skittish rabbits would pause in their endless vigilance to appreciate the strange harmony between man and wolf. But their deepening friendship was not without its challenges. One morning in late April, as Ezra was splitting wood outside his cabin, he noticed a rider approaching from the south, the first human visitor he'd had in over a year. The man was Jake Morrison, a rancher whose property lay about 15 miles downstream, and his presence usually meant either trouble or news of trouble. Shadow, who had been dozing in a patch of morning sunlight, immediately rose to his feet at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. His posture shifted into the alert stance Ezra had learned to recognize as protective mode, and the wolf positioned himself between the cabin and the approaching rider with the instinctive precision of a trained guard. "Easy, boy," Ezra said quietly, resting his hand briefly on Shadow's head in a gesture of reassurance. "Let's see what Jake's got to say before we decide whether we need to worry." Jake Morrison was a hard man shaped by a hard life, the kind of rancher who saw every wild animal as a potential threat to his livestock and every predator as an enemy to be eliminated. As he rode into the clearing, his eyes immediately fixed on Shadow with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent years identifying threats. "Morning, Ezra," Jake said, dismounting from his horse but keeping his hand near the rifle strapped to his saddle. "That's quite a dog you got there. Big for a sheepdog, ain't he?" "Shadow's been good company through the winter," Ezra replied, carefully, noting how Jake's eyes never left the wolf despite his casual tone. "Smart animal. Earns his keep by keeping the varmints away from my supplies." "Looks like he's got some wolf in him," Jake observed, his voice carrying the kind of suspicion that Ezra had hoped to avoid. "Been having some trouble with wolves lately. Lost 3 calves last week, and Mrs. Henderson down the valley swears she saw a whole pack running through her property just 2 days ago." Shadow remained perfectly still during this exchange, but Ezra could sense the tension in the wolf's body, the careful readiness of a predator who understood that he was being evaluated as a threat. The collar around his neck might mark him as domesticated, but his wild nature was too obvious to fool anyone with experience reading animals. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any wolf pack around here," Ezra said truthfully, though he was careful not to look at Shadow as he spoke. "This valley's pretty isolated. Most wildlife move through without staying long." Jake nodded slowly, but his expression remained skeptical. "Well, if you do see any sign of wolves, you'd best be careful. The ranchers are talking about organizing a hunt, maybe bringing in some professional hunters from Cheyenne. Can't afford to lose any more stock to predators." As Jake remounted his horse and rode away, Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The casual mention of wolf hunters sent ice through his veins, and he realized that their peaceful isolation was more fragile than he had allowed himself to believe. That evening, as he and Shadow sat together on the porch, Ezra played his harmonica with less enthusiasm than usual. The music that emerged was melancholy, touched with worry and the weight of secrets that were becoming harder to keep. "We might have trouble coming, boy," he said as Shadow's voice joined his in a harmony that seemed to acknowledge the change in mood. "Folks around here don't take kindly to wolves, and that collar's not going to fool anyone who looks close enough." Shadow pressed closer to Ezra's side, offering comfort in the way he had learned to do when his human friend was troubled. In the growing darkness, they made music together despite their worries, creating beauty in the face of uncertainty and finding strength in the bond that had grown between them through months of shared trust and mutual care. The harmonica's silver surface caught the last rays of sunset as Ezra played, and Shadow's voice rose and fell with the melody like a prayer offered to the gathering night. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by friendship and sustained by the music they had learned to make from the raw materials of loneliness and hope. The community meeting was held at the Miller homestead, in a barn that smelled of hay and livestock and the accumulated sweat of worried farmers. Ezra had debated whether to attend, knowing that his presence might draw unwanted attention to his own situation. But absence would have been more suspicious than participation. So he rode his old mare the 12 miles to the Miller place, leaving Shadow with strict instructions to stay hidden near the cabin. The barn was packed with nearly 30 ranchers and farmers from throughout the valley, their weathered faces grim with the shared burden of men who had lost livestock and sleep to predators they couldn't control. Jake Morrison stood near the front, serving as unofficial spokesman for the group, while Tom Miller provided the venue and the coffee that helped fuel the evening's discussions. We've lost over 40 head in the past 2 months, Jake was saying, as Ezra found a place to stand near the back of the gathering. Calves mostly, but also some yearlings that should have been able to defend themselves. Whatever's doing this is smart, organized, and getting bolder by the week. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ezra recognized most of the faces men he'd known casually for years. Neighbors in the loose way that frontier folk counted neighbors, even when they lived 20 miles apart. Good men, for the most part, though shaped by a landscape that taught harsh lessons about survival and the necessity of protecting what was yours. I say we organize a proper hunt, declared Ben Hawkins, a sheep rancher whose property bordered the national forest. Pool our resources, maybe hire some professional hunters from back east. These wolves are costing us too much to handle with half measures. Professional hunters cost money we ain't got, countered Sarah Patterson, one of the few women in the group and the widow who ran the largest cattle operation in the county. But we got rifles and we got dogs. Organized properly, we can track these predators ourselves. Ezra listened to the discussion with growing unease. These weren't bloodthirsty men talking about casual slaughter. They were concerned farmers and ranchers, whose livelihoods were being threatened by forces beyond their control. In their position, with families to feed and bills to pay, he might well be advocating for the same solutions. Question is, where are they denning? Asked Tom Mueller, a German immigrant whose accent still colored his English despite 20 years. In Wyoming. Wolves, they need territory, safe places to raise pups. Find the den. Solve the problem. Could be anywhere in those high country caves, Jake replied. Or maybe they're denning closer than we think. Wolves are smart enough to hide right under our noses if they think they can get away with it. The conversation continued for another hour with various theories about pack size, hunting patterns, and potential strategies for elimination. Maps were consulted, territories divided for systematic searching, and volunteers organized into hunting parties that would begin their work at first light. Ezra contributed little to the discussion, offering only occasional nods of agreement when direct participation seemed expected. But his mind was racing with the implications of what he was hearing. These men knew their business when it came to predator control, and their methodical approach would eventually lead them to every wolf in the territory, including Shadow. Ezra, you're mighty quiet tonight, Jake observed as the meeting began to wind down. Your place is pretty isolated up there in that hidden valley. You seen any sign of wolves in your area? All eyes turned toward Ezra, and he felt the weight of their expectation like a physical pressure. These were his neighbors, men who had shown him respect and offered help when he'd needed it. Lying to them felt like a betrayal of the community, bonds that had sustained frontier life for generations. Can't say I have, Ezra replied carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man walking across thin ice. But then again, I don't run livestock anymore. Might be they're avoiding my area because there's nothing there worth hunting. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. But keep your eyes open, will you? If you spot anything unusual, send word. We're going to need all the information we can get if we're going to put an end to this problem. As the meeting broke up and men began heading home through the darkness, Ezra found himself walking alongside Doc Brennan, the closest thing to a medical professional the valley possessed. The old doctor had been a friend of sorts since Ezra had helped him through a difficult delivery 3 winters ago, and his counsel had often proved valuable. Tough situation, Doc observed as they walked toward their horses. Nobody wants to kill wolves for the sake of killing, but when they start taking livestock, what choice do folks have? Not much choice at all, Ezra agreed, though the words felt like sawdust in his mouth. Man's got to protect what's his. Still, Doc continued, lowering his voice as they moved away from the other departing ranchers. Seems to me there might be more to this situation than meets the eye. Wolves are smart creatures, generally avoid humans when they can. For a pack to get this bold, this fast, well, it makes a man wonder what might be driving them to such desperate measures. Ezra glanced at the older man, trying to read his expression. In the dim light from the barn lanterns. What do you mean? Just that sometimes when wild animals start acting out of character, there's usually a reason beyond simple hunger. Could be disease, could be territory disputes with other packs, could be any number of factors that we don't see because we're only looking at the symptoms, not the cause. They reached their horses, and Doc paused in the act of checking his saddle cinch. You ever think about that, Ezra? How sometimes the thing that looks like the problem isn't really the problem at all, just a symptom of something deeper. Can't say I have, Ezra replied, though Doc's words resonated with uncomfortable accuracy. But then again, I'm not much for complicated thinking. Simple solutions for simple problems. That's more my way. Doc smiled and swung into his saddle with the ease of a man who had been riding before he could walk. Simple's good when it works. But sometimes the world gives us complicated problems that need complicated solutions. You take care of yourself up there in that valley, Ezra. And if you ever need to talk through any complicated problems, you know where to find me. The ride home took 2 hours through darkness, so complete that Ezra had to trust his Mare's instincts to navigate the familiar trails. His mind churned with the evening's revelations, with the weight of decisions that seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. By morning, the first hunting parties would be in the field, armed men with experienced dogs and a systematic plan for eliminating every wolf in the territory. When he finally reached his cabin, Shadow was waiting on the porch, amber eyes reflecting the lantern light as Ezra approached. The wolf's presence was a comfort and a burden simultaneously, a reminder of the friendship that had transformed his lonely existence and the secret that now threatened to destroy both their lives. Inside the cabin, Ezra hung his hat on its peg and moved to the trunk where he kept his old cavalry gear. His service saber lay at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and carefully maintained despite years of disuse. The steel was still bright, the edge still keen, though he hadn't drawn it in anger since the war ended more than a decade ago. He lifted the weapon from its wrapping, feeling the familiar weight of tempered steel in his hands. Once, this saber had been an extension of his, well, a tool for protecting what he believed in and cutting down those who threatened it. Now, it represented a choice he had hoped never to face again, the choice between peace and violence, between the man he had become and the soldier he had once been. Shadow entered the cabin and settled on Mary's shawl, watching as Ezra examined the saber with the careful attention of a man preparing for war. The wolf seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, the way tension had entered the small space like an unwelcome visitor. Things are about to get complicated, boy, Ezra said quietly, setting the saber aside but leaving it within easy reach. Come morning, this valley is going to be crawling with hunters, and they're not going to be interested in hearing about the difference between good wolves and bad ones. Shadow's ears flicked forward at the sound of Ezra's voice, but the wolf remained still, as if he understood that this was a time for listening rather than responding. I could take you deeper into the mountains, Ezra continued, working through possibilities aloud. Find you a place to hide until this all blows over. But that would mean leaving you on your own again, and after what we've built together, that feels like abandonment. The alternative, staying and fighting if necessary, would mean drawing his saber for the first time in years, possibly taking human lives to protect a creature that most would consider nothing more than a predator. It would mean choosing Shadow over his human neighbors, placing their friendship above the bonds of community that had sustained him through his years of grief. But as Ezra looked at Shadow lying peacefully on Mary's shawl, he realized that the choice had already been made. This wolf had saved his life, had filled the empty spaces in his heart with companionship and purpose. Shadow had become family in ways that transcended species, and family was worth protecting. Whatever the cost, the saber gleamed in the firelight, cold steel carrying the weight of decisions yet to be made. Outside, the Wyoming night continued its ancient rhythm, unaware that tomorrow would bring hunters to the valley and force a gentle giant and his unlikely friend to discover just how far they were willing to go to protect what they had found in each other. The discovery came 3 days after the community meeting, when Ezra was checking his snares along the creek that bordered his property. Shadow had been more restless than usual that morning, pacing the perimeter of the clearing with the focused intensity of a sentry who sensed approaching danger. When Ezra set out to check his trap line, the wolf insisted on accompanying him, staying closer than normal and constantly testing the air for scents that might spell trouble. They were following the creek downstream when Shadow suddenly froze, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Ezra followed the wolf's gaze to a stand of willows near the water's edge, where something red caught the morning light like a warning flag. "Easy, boy," Ezra murmured, reaching for the rifle he carried during his daily rounds. But as they approached the willows, it became clear that whatever had happened here was already finished. The red was blood, dried and dark against the pale bark of the trees, and scattered around the small grove were the remains of what had once been a young calf. Ezra's heart sank as he examined the scene. The calf had been killed recently, probably during the night, and the method of killing left no doubt about the predator responsible. Wolf tracks were everywhere in the soft earth near the creek, the prints of a large pack that had worked together to bring down prey that should have been too big for any single animal to handle. But it was what he found next that stopped his breath entirely. Tangled in the willows, torn and bloody, was a piece of red fabric that he recognized immediately. It was part of a bandana that Shadow had been wearing around his neck just 2 days earlier, a bright red cloth that Ezra had given him as a replacement for the original collar when the leather had begun to wear thin. "Shadow," Ezra called softly, his voice tight with confusion and dawning horror. The wolf approached cautiously, his amber eyes fixed on the blood-stained fabric with an intensity that seemed almost human in its complexity. Ezra knelt and picked up the bandana, noting the tears that suggested a violent struggle. The fabric was soaked with blood, but as he examined it more closely, he realized that not all of the blood belonged to the calf. Mixed with the bovine scent was something else, the iron smell of wolf blood, and beneath that, the familiar musk that belonged specifically to Shadow. "You were here," Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper as understanding began to dawn. "You were here when this happened." Shadow moved closer, pressing against Ezra's leg in a gesture that had become their established sign of communication and comfort. But instead of the usual calm presence, Ezra sensed something different in the wolf's behavior and urgency, almost a desperation to be understood. Rising slowly, Ezra began to examine the scene with the careful attention to detail that his cavalry training had ingrained. The tracks told a story, but it wasn't the story he had initially assumed. Yes, there were wolf prints everywhere, but they didn't all belong to the same pack. The largest prints, Shadow's prints, were concentrated around the calf's body, but they were overlaid by the tracks of at least 6 other wolves, smaller animals that had arrived after Shadow. More telling were the patterns of blood spatter and the way the vegetation had been disturbed. The calf had indeed been killed by wolves, but the killing had been interrupted. There were signs of a fierce battle between different groups of predators, with Shadow's tracks consistently positioned between the calf and the other wolves, as if he had been defending the kill rather than participating in it. "You aren't hunting," Ezra breathed, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. "You were protecting. You were trying to stop them." Shadow's ears pricked forward at the recognition in Ezra's voice, and the wolf made a soft whining sound that carried depths of communication beyond simple vocalization. Moving carefully around the scene, Ezra began to piece together what had actually happened in this stand of willows. The calf had wandered away from its mother, probably drawn to the creek for water. The pack Shadow's former pack, based on the size and distribution of the tracks, had cornered it in the willows and begun the kill. But Shadow had arrived before they could finish, and instead of joining the hunt, as they expected, he had tried to drive them away from their prey. The battle that followed had been brief but vicious. Shadow had fought alone against 6 members of his former pack, sustaining wounds that had left his blood on the torn bandana while trying to protect livestock that belonged to humans he had never met. The other wolves had eventually overwhelmed him through sheer numbers, completing their kill and leaving Shadow bleeding and defeated among the willows. "My God," Ezra whispered, looking at Shadow with new eyes. "You've been protecting the whole valley, haven't you? All those times you disappeared during the night. All those mornings when you came back looking tired, you weren't hunting with them. You were fighting them." The magnitude of what Shadow had been doing hit Ezra like a thunderbolt. While the ranchers and farmers had been organizing hunting parties to eliminate the wolf threat, Shadow had been waging a solitary war against his own kind, trying to prevent the very attacks that had prompted the human response. The blood-stained bandana was evidence of a sacrifice that no one had witnessed, a loyalty that extended far beyond the simple gratitude of a well-fed animal. Shadow had chosen to protect humans over wolves, civilization over wilderness, the man who had shown him kindness over the pack that had raised him. And he had paid for that choice with blood and exile, fighting battles that he couldn't win but refusing to abandon his self-appointed duty as guardian of the valley. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted Ezra's revelation. Through the trees, he could see riders approaching 3 men he recognized as members of the hunting party that had been organized at the community meeting. Jake Morrison led the group, with Ben Hawkins and Tom Mueller flanking him, all 3, armed and clearly following the same trail that had led Ezra to this gory scene. "Ezra," Jake called as he spotted the tall figure among the willows. "We heard your voice and thought you might be in trouble. What did you find?" There was no time to hide the evidence, no way to protect Shadow from the assumptions that the hunting party would inevitably make. A wolf at the scene of a fresh kill, blood on the ground, tracks everywhere. It was exactly the kind of evidence that would justify immediate action. Shadow sensed the approaching danger and moved closer to Ezra, his body language shifting into the protective stance that had become second nature during their months together. But Ezra could see the exhaustion in the wolf's movements, the way he favored his left side where the pack had wounded him during the night's battle. "Found what's left of one of your calves," Ezra called back, his mind racing through possibilities. "Looks like wolves got it during the night." The 3 riders dismounted and approached the scene, rifles ready and eyes alert for any sign of predators that might still be in the area. When they saw Shadow standing beside Ezra, their weapons swung toward the wolf with the automatic responsive men who had spent years dealing with livestock predators. "Jesus, Ezra!" Jake exclaimed, raising his rifle. "Get away from that wolf. Can't you see the blood on it?" "Wait," Ezra said, stepping between Shadow and the hunters. "This isn't what it looks like." "Looks like we found our killer," Ben Hawkins said grimly, his own weapon trained on Shadow. "Big gray wolf, blood all over him, standing right next to a fresh kill. Don't get much clearer than that." "You don't understand," Ezra insisted, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. Shadow wasn't hunting with them. He was fighting them. Look at the tracks, really look at them. This wolf tried to stop the killing, not participate in it. Tom Mueller had been examining the scene with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read sign during his years on the frontier. "Ezra might be right," he said slowly. "These tracks, they tell a complicated story. Looks like there was a hell of a fight here, and your wolf took the worst of it." Jake moved closer to examine the evidence, his rifle still trained on Shadow, but his expression thoughtful rather than immediately hostile. The blood-stained bandana caught his attention, and he recognized it as human-made rather than natural. "That's your bandana," he observed, looking at Ezra with dawning understanding. "This wolf belongs to you." There was no point in denying it now. The evidence was too clear, the situation too desperate for continued deception. "His name is Shadow," Ezra said quietly. "And yes, he's been living with me through the winter. But he's not the problem you think he is. He's been trying to solve it." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, changing everything about the dynamics of the situation. Jake's expression shifted from suspicion to a complex mixture of surprise, betrayal, and grudging respect. "You've been harboring a wolf," he said, his voice flat with the weight of accusation. "All this time, while we've been losing stock and organizing hunts, you've been keeping a predator as a pet." "Not a pet," Ezra corrected. "A friend and a protector. Look at the evidence, Jake. Really, look at it. Shadow's been fighting his own pack to protect your livestock. The blood on that bandana isn't from killing, it's from defending." Ben Hawkins lowered his rifle slightly, his weathered face creased with confusion. "You're saying this wolf has been fighting other wolves to protect our cattle?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Ezra replied. "And I've got the proof right here in front of you, if you're willing to see it." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. 3 armed hunters, 1 protective rancher, and a wounded wolf standing in a grove of willows beside the evidence of a battle that would redefine everything they thought they knew about loyalty, friendship, and the complex relationship between civilization and the wild. Shadow remained motionless beside Ezra, his amber eyes fixed on the humans who held his fate in their hands, waiting to see whether the truth would be enough to save him from the consequences of choosing love over instinct, protection over predation, and a lonely man's friendship over the call of his own kind. The ride back to Ezra's cabin was conducted in tense silence, with Jake Morrison and his men following at a respectful distance while Shadow limped alongside Ezra's mar. The wolf's injuries from his battle with the pack were more severe than Ezra had initially realized. Deep gashes along his left flank and a pronounced limp that suggested damaged muscles or possibly cracked ribs. Once they reached the cabin, Ezra immediately set about tending to Shadow's wounds while the 3 hunters watched with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. From his old cavalry medical kit, Ezra retrieved supplies that had served him well during the war, clean bandages, antiseptic powder, and surgical thread that he'd maintained in perfect condition despite years of disuse. "Hold still, boy," Ezra murmured as he cleaned the worst of Shadow's wounds with careful precision. The wolf submitted to the treatment with remarkable patience, occasionally whimpering when the antiseptic bit into torn flesh, but never attempting to snap or pull away. From his human friend's ministrations, Jake Morrison stood in the doorway, watching the intimate care with which Ezra treated the injured wolf. "I've seen men tend their horses with less consideration," he observed quietly. "This animal really does mean something to you. More than I ever expected when I first fed him," Ezra admitted, wrapping a bandage around Shadow's ribs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated battlefield wounds. "Started as simple charity man, an animal both trying to survive a hard winter. Became something I didn't know I was capable of anymore." Tom Mueller had been examining the tracks around Ezra's cabin with the methodical attention of an experienced tracker. "These signs tell a story too," he announced, pointing to marks in the earth that spoke of regular patrols and defensive positioning. "This wolf's been guarding your property like a trained sentry. Look here, tracks going in regular circuits. Investigation points where he checked for threats, resting spots positioned to give him clear views of all approaches." Ben Hawkins joined Mueller in studying the evidence, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. "Never seen anything like it. It's like he's been running military patrols around your homestead." "Shadow's smart," Ezra said, finishing. "The bandaging, and offering the wolf a piece of jerk beef as reward for his patience. Smarter than any animal I've ever worked with, including some of the cavalry horses I trained during the war. He understands strategy, territory, protection duties. It's like he appointed himself guardian of this whole valley. Jake removed his hat and ran his fingers through graying hair, a gesture Ezra recognized as the rancher's way of processing information that challenged his fundamental assumptions. If what you're saying is true, if this wolf really has been fighting his own pack to protect our livestock, then we've been hunting the wrong predator. That's exactly what I'm saying, Ezra replied, settling into a chair near the fire while Shadow arranged himself on Mary's shawl with careful attention to his bandaged wounds. The real problem is the pack Shadow left behind. They're the ones doing the killing, and they're getting bolder because they've lost their strongest member. Mueller nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense from a wolf behavior standpoint. Packs have territories, hierarchies, established hunting patterns. Remove the alpha, and the dynamics change completely. Sometimes they get more aggressive, trying to prove themselves. Or they get more desperate, Ben added. If this Shadow was their best hunter, losing him would put pressure on the rest to take bigger risks. Go after prey they might normally avoid. The implications of this revelation began to sink in as the four men contemplated the true nature of the threat they faced. Instead of a single large pack terrorizing the valley, they were dealing with a group of wolves that had been destabilized by the loss of their strongest member, a loss that had occurred because the member had chosen to protect humans rather than hunt with his own kind. The question now, Jake said slowly, is what we do about it. The other ranchers are expecting results from our hunting parties. We can't just tell them to call off the search because one wolf has been playing guardian angel. We don't have to call off anything, Ezra replied, his voice taking on the tactical edge that had served him during his military days. We just redirect the hunt toward the real problem pack. Shadow knows their territory, their habits, their denning sites. With his help, we could track them down in a fraction of the time it would take using conventional methods. Shadow's ears pricked up at the mention of his name, and the wolf lifted his head to regard the humans with intelligent amber eyes. There was something in his expression that suggested he understood more of the conversation than should have been possible for a wild animal, as if he recognized that decisions were being made about his future and the future of his former pack. You're talking about using a wolf to hunt wolves, Jake observed. That's either the smartest thing I've ever heard or the craziest. Both, probably, Ezra admitted. But it's also our best chance to end this problem without a wholesale slaughter of every predator in the territory. Shadow knows things we don't then. Locations, pack dynamics, hunting patterns that could take us months to figure out on our own. Mueller was nodding with growing enthusiasm. It's like having a scout who speaks the enemy's language. We could set up ambush, predict their movements, maybe even drive them out of the territory without having to kill them all. And if it doesn't work, Ben asked, ever the pragmatist. If this tame wolf of yours leads us into an ambush, or if his loyalty to his human friend doesn't extend to betraying his own species. Ezra met Ben's gaze steadily. Then we'll be no worse off than we are now, and we'll have learned something valuable about the limits of trust between species. But I believe Shadow will help us, because he's already been fighting them on his own. This would just give him backup. The conversation continued for another hour as they worked out the practical details of their unconventional plan. Jake would return to town and organize a select group of the most experienced hunters, men who could be trusted to understand the delicate nature of their mission and the importance of keeping Shadow's role secret from the broader community. Mueller and Hawkins would scout the perimeter of the territory, looking for sign that might corroborate Shadow's knowledge of pack movements. As the three men prepared to leave, Jake paused at the cabin door and turned back to face Ezra. You know this changes everything, he said quietly. "If word gets out about what you've been doing harboring a wolf, forming an attachment to a predator, there'll be folks who want to understand. Some might even see it as betrayal of your own species." "I know," Ezra replied, his hand resting gently on Shadow's head. "But some things are worth the risk. Shadow saved my life during that blizzard, and he's been saving your livestock ever since, even though it cost him his pack and nearly got him killed. If that's not worth standing up for, I don't know what is." After the hunters departed, Ezra spent the evening preparing for what he knew would be a dangerous mission. His old cavalry gear came out of storage weapons, cleaned and oiled. Equipment checked and repaired, maps studied and annotated with everything he knew about the local terrain. Shadow watched these preparations with the focused attention of a creature that understood the significance of pre-battle rituals. When Ezra cleaned his rifle and pistol, the wolf's ears tracked every movement. When maps were spread on the table, Shadow approached and sniffed at the paper as if trying to understand the strange symbols that meant so much to his human companion. "Tomorrow, we start hunting your old pack," Ezra said, as he settled into his chair for the evening. "I know it can't be easy, turning against your own kind. But they made their choice when they started killing livestock, and you made yours when you chose to protect instead of destroy." Shadow moved closer, settling at Ezra's feet with a soft sigh that seemed to carry the weight of difficult decisions. In the firelight, his bandaged wounds looked like badges of honor rather than marks of defeat, evidence of battles fought for principles that transcended the simple call of survival. Outside, the Wyoming night was unusually quiet, as if the natural world was holding its breath in anticipation of the conflict to come. Somewhere in the darkness, a pack of wolves was planning their next hunt, unaware that their former packmate had become their greatest threat. And in a small cabin hidden in a mountain valley, a man and a wolf were forging an alliance that would test the bonds of friendship against the ancient call of blood and species. The medical kit sat open on the table, its contents bearing witness to the trust that had developed between predator and prey, between wilderness and civilization, between two lonely souls who had found in each other something worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring danger and difficult choices, but tonight they had each other, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some bridges, once built, could bear any weight that might be placed upon them. The hunting party assembled at dawn. 6 men on horseback with Shadow moving like a gray ghost between their mounts. Jake Morrison had chosen his companions carefully, experienced trackers who could be trusted to understand the unprecedented nature of their mission and the need for absolute discretion. Ezra rode his father's old hunting rifle across his saddle, the weapon's familiar weight bringing back memories of cavalry raids and desperate battles, fought in service of causes that seemed simpler than the complex loyalties he navigated now. His grandfather's hunting rifle had been passed down through 3 generations of McCready men, each adding their own modifications and memories to the well-maintained weapon. Shadow's injuries from his battle with the pack had healed enough to allow travel, though Ezra could see the wolf favoring his left side as they moved through the morning mist. The animal's determination was remarkable, despite his wounds. He had insisted on leading them toward the territory where his former packmates had established their hunting grounds. "Never thought I'd be taking tracking advice from a wolf," muttered Ben Hawkins as they followed Shadow's lead through a maze of deer trails that wound between towering pines. "But I'll be damned if he doesn't seem to know exactly where he's going." Tom Mueller, riding point with his rifle ready, raised his hand for silence as Shadow suddenly froze ahead of them. The wolf's ears were pricked forward, his nose testing the air with the focused intensity of a creature, reading messages written in scent and sound that humans could never perceive. Ezra dismounted quietly and approached Shadow, reading the wolf's body language with the fluency that months of partnership had taught him. Shadow was tense, but not alarmed alert to the presence of his former pack, but confident in his ability to handle whatever they might encounter. "They're close," Ezra whispered to Jake, who had moved up beside him with the silent step of an experienced hunter. Shadow can smell them, probably hear them too. We're getting near their current territory. The terrain ahead was perfect wolf country, dense forest broken by rocky outcroppings that provided elevated observation points, with several small streams that would mask scent trails and provide fresh water for a traveling pack. It was also dangerous ground for mounted men, with countless opportunities for ambush and limited visibility through the thick canopy. Jake made the decision to proceed on foot, leaving their horses picketed in a small meadow where they could be easily retrieved if a quick escape became necessary. The hunting party moved forward in the spread formation that frontier experience had taught them, each man positioned to provide covering fire for his neighbors while maintaining visual contact through the trees. Shadow ranged ahead of them like a living extension of their senses, his movements flowing between the trees with the liquid grace of a creature perfectly adapted to forest hunting. Occasionally, he would pause to investigate a scent mark or track, his behavior providing information that supplemented their human understanding of the terrain. They had been moving for perhaps an hour when Shadow's demeanor changed dramatically. The wolf dropped into a crouch, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Ahead, through a break in the trees, they could see movement, the dark shapes of wolves moving through the forest with the purposeful gait of predators on the hunt. There they are, Jake breathed, raising his rifle as he counted the shapes moving between the trees. I make it 6 animals, all adults, heading toward the Patterson Ranch. Ezra studied the pack through his rifle scope, noting their size and condition. These were healthy, well-fed wolves, larger and more aggressive-looking than the desperate creature he had first encountered outside his cabin. Their leader was a massive gray male, scarred from countless battles and moving with the confident stride of an apex predator that had never learned to fear humans. The big gray is their alpha, Ezra observed quietly. Take him down, and the pack structure collapses. The others will scatter or submit to new leadership. Shadow had begun to move forward, his body language shifting into the hunting posture that Ezra had seen during their morning walks around the cabin property. But this was different, more focused, more dangerous, carrying the weight of decisions that went beyond simple territorial disputes. Shadow, Ezra called softly, using the tone that had always brought the wolf back to his side. But this time, Shadow ignored the command, continuing to stalk forward toward his former packmates with deadly intent. The confrontation, when it came, erupted with shocking suddenness. The alpha male caught Shadow's scent and wheeled to face this unexpected challenger, his lips pulling back to reveal fangs that gleamed white in the filtered sunlight. The two wolves faced each other across a small clearing, former packmates now separated by choices that had made them enemies. The alpha's snarl was answered by Shadow's own challenge, a sound that carried all the weight of battles fought alone, of loyalty chosen over instinct, of protection offered to those who had no reason to expect it. When the two wolves collided in the center of the clearing, the impact sounded like thunder rolling through the forest. The battle was brief but vicious, two powerful predators settling a dispute that had been building since the night Shadow had first chosen human friendship over pack loyalty. They rolled and snapped, each seeking the throat hold that would end the fight decisively, while the rest of the pack circled uncertainly, unsure whether to join the battle or wait for its resolution. It was then that Jake Morrison made the shot that would be talked about in the valley for decades to come. His rifle cracked once, the sound echoing through the forest like a judge's gavel, and the alpha wolf dropped mid-attack, killed instantly by a bullet placed with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years hunting on the frontier. The effect on the remaining pack was immediate and dramatic. Deprived of their leader and faced with the unexpected return of their former packmate, now clearly allied with humans, the 5 surviving wolves scattered into the forest with the panicked flight of creatures whose entire world had just been overturned. Shadow stood over the body of his former alpha, his flanks heaving from exertion and his muzzle bloodied from the brief but violent encounter. When Ezra approached, the wolf looked up with amber eyes that seemed to hold depths of emotion that went beyond simple animal response. "It's finished," Ezra said quietly, resting his hand on Shadow's head in a gesture of comfort and congratulation. "They'll leave the territory now, find somewhere else to hunt. You won't have to fight them anymore." The hunting party spent the rest of the day tracking the scattered wolves to ensure they were indeed leaving the valley, following their trail until it led beyond the boundaries of the ranching community and into the high country where livestock would be safe from their predation stud. As they rode home through the afternoon sunlight, Ezra reflected on the strange turns that life could take, the unexpected alliances that could form between the most unlikely partners. Shadow trotted alongside his horse, no longer wounded and limping, but moving with the confident stride of a creature that had found his place in the world through choosing loyalty over instinct, friendship over blood. The grandfather's rifle rode easy in its scabbard, another chapter added to its long history of service to the McCready family. But today, it had served not just human interests, but the cause of justice itself, protecting an animal that had chosen to protect others, honoring a friendship that transcended the boundaries between species and civilization. The photograph had been in Ezra's shirt pocket for so long that its edges had worn soft as fabric. The image faded, but still clear enough to show the faces he cherished most in the world. Mary stood in the center, her hand resting on young Thomas's shoulder, while little Sarah grinned up at the camera with the infectious joy that had defined her brief life. He discovered the photograph was missing as they made camp that evening. The hunting party, having decided to spend the night in the high country before returning to the valley. His hand went automatically to his pocket during their evening meal, seeking the familiar comfort of that worn image, only to find empty space where his most precious possession should have been. "Something wrong?" Jake asked, noting the sudden tension in Ezra's posture as he searched through his gear with increasing desperation. "My family's photograph," Ezra said, his voice tight with the kind of panic that comes from losing something irreplaceable. "It was in my pocket this morning, but now—" He stopped, his hand freezing as memory supplied the answer to his unspoken question. The battle. During Shadow's confrontation with the alpha wolf, when Ezra had knelt beside his wounded friend and checked his injuries, the photograph must have fallen from his pocket onto the forest floor. It was lying somewhere in that blood-soaked clearing, probably trampled into the earth by the boots of 6 men and the paws of scattered wolves. "We can go back," Tom Mueller offered, reading the devastation in Ezra's expression. "It's only a few hours' ride, and we know the way." But Jake was shaking his head, his weathered face grim with the kind of practical concern that frontier life demanded. "Storms coming in from the west," he said, nodding toward the dark clouds that were building against the mountain peaks. "We go back now, we might not make it home before it hits. Could be dangerous, especially in this terrain." Ezra looked at the approaching weather, reading the signs with the expertise of a man who had learned to respect the power of mountain storms. Jake was right. The clouds were heavy with snow, and the wind was already picking up with the sharp bite that warned of a blizzard in the making. But the photograph contained the only images he possessed of his lost family, the only physical proof that they had ever existed beyond the boundaries of his increasingly fragile memory. Without it, he feared that their faces would fade from his mind the way their voices had already begun to blur together in his dreams. "I have to go back," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of absolute necessity. "That photograph is all I have left of them. I can't just leave it lying in the dirt." Shadow, who had been resting near the fire, lifted his head at the change in tone. The wolf's amber eyes moved from Ezra's face to the darkening sky, and his expression seemed to mirror the conflict between duty and wisdom that was playing out in his human friend's mind. "Then we all go," Jake said, beginning to pack his gear, with the resigned efficiency of a man who understood that some things were worth risking everything to preserve. "Won't leave you to face a storm alone, not after what we've been through together." But Ezra was shaking his head, his hand moving, to rest on Shadow's neck in a gesture that had become second nature over their months together. "No sense in all of us taking that risk. Shadow and I can make better time alone, and we know that country better than anyone. You boys head home before the weather turns ugly." The argument continued for another hour, but Ezra's mind was made up. As the first snowflakes began to fall, he saddled his Mari and prepared for the dangerous ride back to the clearing where his past and present had collided in violence and blood. Shadow needed no encouragement to accompany him. The wolf seemed to understand the importance of their mission, moving with the focused intensity of a creature that recognized when everything meaningful was at stake. They rode through the gathering darkness, following familiar trails that were already beginning to disappear under the accumulating snow. The wind picked up steadily, driving flakes into their faces with increasing force. But Ezra pushed forward with the single-minded determination of a man who had already lost too much to surrender without a fight. It was nearly midnight when they reached the clearing, where the morning's battle had taken place. The snow had covered most of the blood, transforming the scene of violence into something that looked almost peaceful in the pale light of a cloud-covered moon. Ezra dismounted and began searching methodically, using his hands to feel through the snow for the familiar texture of worn paper and faded ink. Shadow helped, using his superior senses to investigate areas where human scent might have lingered from the morning's activities. It was Shadow who found it, nosing at a depression near the base of a large pine where the photograph had been trampled into a mixture of snow and pine needles. When Ezra lifted it carefully from its hiding place, he felt his heart sink at the damage the image had sustained. The photograph was torn nearly in half, Mary's face separated from those of the children by a jagged rip that seemed to mirror the way death had divided his family. The image was water-stained and dirty, though still recognizable to eyes that had memorized every detail over years of loving study. But as Ezra knelt in the snow, holding the damaged photograph with hands that shook from more than cold, he realized that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with these cherished images. The faces still brought him joy and pain in equal measure, but they no longer felt like the only things in his life worth preserving. Shadow pressed against his side, offering comfort and warmth in the way he had learned to do when his human friend was troubled. The wolf's presence was solid and real, a reminder that love could be found in unexpected places and that family could be defined by choice as much as by blood. "They're gone," Ezra said quietly, his words addressed as much to Shadow as to the memory of his lost family. "Mary and the children, they're gone, and keeping their pictures won't bring them back. But you're here, and you chose to be here, and maybe that's a different kind of miracle." The storm was intensifying, making the return journey increasingly dangerous, but Ezra felt a peace settling over him that had nothing to do with the recovery of the photograph. He carefully tucked the damaged image back into his pocket, but its weight felt different now, less like an anchor holding him to the past and more like a bridge connecting what he had lost with what he had found. As they began the treacherous ride home through the blizzard, Ezra realized that the photograph had served its purpose not by being preserved, but by being lost and recovered. In the act of risking everything to retrieve those faded images, he had discovered that his capacity for love hadn't died with his family. It had simply been waiting for someone worth the risk of caring again. Shadow moved through the storm with the sure-footed confidence of a creature that had found his place in the world, no longer torn between competing loyalties, but secure in the knowledge that he had chosen wisely. Behind them, the clearing where two species had learned to trust each other was disappearing under the snow. But the bond forged in that place would endure long after the last traces of battle had been erased by weather and time. Spring returned to the valley with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the transformation that had taken place in Ezra McCready's heart. The harsh edges of winter had given way to the soft greens of new growth, and everywhere he looked, life was asserting itself with the quiet determination that had become his own guiding principle. The wooden sign he had carved during the long evenings of late winter now hung proudly from the gate that marked the entrance to his property. McCready and Shadow Ranch. It read in letters that had been burned deep into the seasoned pine, each character shaped with the careful attention of a man who understood the importance of declaring his intentions to the world. The sign had raised eyebrows among his neighbors when they first saw it, but the events of the previous winter had earned both Ezra and Shadow a respect that transcended conventional boundaries. Word of the wolf's protection of the valley's livestock had spread through the community with the kind of mythic power that frontier stories possessed, growing in the telling until Shadow had become something approaching a local legend. Children from the surrounding ranches would sometimes ride out with their parents just to catch a glimpse of the famous wolf, though Shadow remained cautious around strangers and rarely showed himself unless Ezra was present. But when he did appear, moving with the dignified grace that had always marked his character, even the most skeptical visitors found themselves awed by the intelligence that shone in his amber eyes. Ezra had expanded his small cabin during the spring months, adding a second room that served as both workshop and library. The walls were lined with books that neighbors had donated or traded, volumes on animal behavior, frontier medicine, and the kind of practical knowledge that made the difference between survival and prosperity in the wilderness. But the most significant addition to his library was a leather-bound journal in which he had begun recording his observations of Shadow's behavior and their developing communication methods. What had started as simple notes had evolved into something approaching a scientific study of interspecies friendship, documented with the careful attention to detail that his military training had ingrained. Day 127. Read a typical entry. Shadow demonstrated what appears to be teaching behavior today, showing me how to identify wolf scat that indicates territorial marking versus simple elimination. His patience with my obvious limitations suggests a level of abstract thinking that challenges conventional understanding of predator intelligence. The journal contained hundreds of such observations, each one building toward a comprehensive picture of what was possible when trust replaced fear in the relationship between human and wolf. Ezra had begun corresponding with naturalists in the territorial capital, sharing his findings with men who possessed a formal education to appreciate the significance of what he was documenting. Their evening musical sessions had evolved as well, with Shadow's vocalizations becoming increasingly sophisticated as he learned to modulate his voice in harmony with Ezra's harmonica. They had developed what could only be described as a repertoire, certain melodies that Shadow seemed to prefer, others that he would modify with his own vocal contributions until they became something entirely new. On this particular evening, in early May, as they sat together on the expanded porch that now commanded a view of the entire valley, their music attracted an audience that would have been unthinkable during the previous winter. A family of deer had emerged from the forest to graze in the meadow below, their usual wariness replaced by a kind of peaceful acceptance of the strange harmony between man and wolf. "Look at that," Ezra murmured, lowering his harmonica as he watched the deer move through the wildflowers that had transformed his meadow into a carpet of color. "They're not afraid anymore. They know this is a safe place." Shadow's response was a soft chuff of agreement, his attention divided between the grazing deer and the sound of approaching hoofbeats that announced visitors. But these were familiar sounds, and Shadow's body language remained relaxed as Jake, Morrison, and Doc Brennan rode into the clearing, their regular monthly visits having become a treasured part of Ezra's social routine. "Evening, Ezra Shadow," Jake called as he dismounted. The casual inclusion of the wolf in his greeting, reflecting how completely Shadow had been accepted as a member of the community. "Brought you something from town that I thought you might find interesting." Doc Brennan handed Ezra a letter bearing the official seal of the territorial government, the formal appearance of which immediately captured his attention. "Seems your correspondence with those naturalist fellows has attracted some attention in higher circles," Doc explained with a smile that suggested good news. The letter was from the territorial governor himself, written in response to reports about Ezra's work with Shadow that had reached the capital through his scientific correspondence. The content was both surprising and deeply gratifying. "Mr. McCready," the letter read, "your documented observations of interspecies cooperation represent a significant contribution to our understanding of wildlife behavior and management. The territorial legislature has voted to designate your property as an official wildlife sanctuary, with you appointed as its first warden. This position comes with a modest salary and the authority to continue your research under territorial protection." The implications of the letter took several minutes to fully sink in. What had begun as a simple act of charity offering food to a starving wolf had evolved into something that might influence how humans and predators coexisted throughout the expanding frontier. "There's more," Jake said, producing a second document from his saddlebags. "The Ranchers Association has voted to establish a fund for predator research, with you and Shadow as the first beneficiaries. Seems folks have decided that understanding beats killing when it comes to managing wildlife problems." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Ezra of Mary's favorite colors, he felt a contentment that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with the simple miracle of purpose rediscovered. Shadow had settled beside his chair, the wolf's presence as natural as breathing after their months together. The damaged photograph of Mary and the children rested in Ezra's shirt pocket, no longer a weight that pulled him toward the past, but a bridge that connected his memories with his hopes for the future. The sign at the gate read, "McCready and Shadow Ranch," but Ezra understood now that it represented something larger than a simple partnership between man and wolf. It was a declaration that friendship could transcend any boundary, that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest courage was required not for fighting, but for the simple act of opening one's heart to the possibility of caring again. In the distance, a new pack of wolves had begun to howl, not Shadow's former enemies, but a different group that was learning to coexist with the humans who shared their territory. Shadow's ears pricked toward the sound, but he remained at Ezra's side, his choice made long ago, during a brutal winter when a lonely man had offered food to a starving predator. The howls faded into the gathering darkness, but their message was clear. The wilderness would endure, and within it, the bonds between unlikely friends would continue to challenge every assumption about what's possible when fear was replaced by understanding. And when the simple words, "I need a friend," and "you need food," could transform two isolated souls into a family that honored both their separate natures and their shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. As night settled over the valley, Ezra McCready and Shadow the wolf sat together in comfortable silence, two guardians watching over a sanctuary where the impossible had become routine, and where every sunrise brought new evidence that some friendships were strong enough to change the world, one act of kindness at a time.